Many of the species do come from the Great Lakes, but there are others, like with the Asian clam, that probably didn't and still have gotten a bit of a foothold in Lake George.
They do have a good foothold in Lake George, unfortunately. When we first found the introduction in about 2008, 2009, we received sort of the cautionary tale from Lake Tahoe, which has a similar tourist economy around the lake, and they said, if you find this species, make sure you do everything you can to try and get rid of it. The reason being is they ended up with acres and acres of lots of dead Asian clam shells, which are not very sightly for the public, for recreation. They could provide a substrate for zebra mussels to colonize on top of, and they may be linked to some kind of changes in the water column that may promote some algal growth. So Lake George took that cautionary tale to heart, and they went after Asian clam, I think, with everything that they had in terms of mussels, sweat, and some blood, trying to put in benthic barrier mats to manage the Asian clams where we found them. We had really great success in killing those clams where we were able to find them. The challenge was that we were not able to detect the juveniles, and over the course of the last nearly a decade, the species has been able to spread around the lake to certain points where there's good habitat in Lake George. So Lake George drains directly into Lake Champlain. We expect that Asian clam will be found in Lake Champlain sometime in the next few years, but we have not found it yet.
There is only one small stream, river, La Chute River, that connects the two lakes, and some of the Asian clams have been found in the northern part of Lake George in the Ticonderoga area.
Yes.
And so getting closer and closer to Lake Champlain.
Yeah.
You mentioned the underwater mats. They seem to be quite effective, smothering a number of the Asian clams, but you mentioned not all of them. So what's the strategy now? And we should mention you've been part of a research and scientific team that's been working on the Asian clams for a number of years now.
Yeah, and the whole Lake George community, from the Darren Freshwater Institute to the Lake George Association, the Fund for Lake George, so many, Lake George Park Commission, have all been working very hard together on Asian clam issues in Lake George, studying them, doing research. It's been a big effort, and I think that our biggest challenge is that we do a lake-wide survey every single year, and we do sieve sampling to see if we can detect Asian clams in new habitat, and we are not able to detect the really young juvenile stage of Asian clam. And there's some suspicion that they're able to, when they're small, maybe get onto some anchors, and Lake George has a lot of visitors that anchor in certain bays and move around. It's really a gorgeous resource there, and we think that the juveniles are able to hitchhike or move around to places when they're really young and we can't see them with the naked eye or in a sieve sample. They may be starting to grow in a bay and we're not able to detect them, and then they are able to take off.
We're about 20 sites now lake-wide?
Yeah, about 20 sites, yep. And there are some sites that we're still looking at in terms of trying to see if we can get rid of them in a certain area. I think the major focus is to look at areas where they can spread. So those would be boat launches around big dock areas, which are challenging to manage if you're thinking about matting around docks and lots of traffic. But we want to manage them at the busiest areas so we can prevent them from spreading to other lakes.
And the Darren Freshwater Institute that you mentioned, are they looking at a biocontrol, some type of a worm that might feed on the Asian clam?
Yeah, there is a worm that has been detected in some of the Asian clams that have been found, and so they go around Lake George, they collect samples and they open them up in the lab and they look to see if any of these worms are present. They've been present in some locations and then absent in others, and there are a number of other factors going on. We've had a few hard winters, we've had a few pretty soft winters. The hard winters tend to have a good impact on them. It doesn't kill them all the way back. But so how does that interact with the worm species? We're learning about it. And maybe in the long-term management of Asian clam, it will be an effective biocontrol.
And probably the best case scenario would be controlling them and keeping them from spreading to other parts of the lake if it gets to that point, but not eradicating.
No, I don't think we're going to be able to eradicate Asian clam from Lake George, and it's been a hard shift because we went in really hard with all the resources we had at the beginning, and that was our goal, was eradication. And after a few years of matting them, really having great success where we map them, but then finding other populations pop up in other locations that we'd previously surveyed, learning that this is turning into a longer-term management and containment program for spread prevention purposes.
And the concern, if they do get in Lake Champlain, then the issue, you have to deal with that in Lake Champlain.
We have a great source there, and we're very connected in Lake Champlain to all the other water bodies in the Adirondack region, as well as the inland water bodies in Vermont and Quebec, for that matter, and that could be a serious source for outbound traffic to uninvaded waters.
What is the biggest concern right now as far as an invasive species getting in Lake Champlain? We talked a little bit about the quagga mussel, spiny water flea, which got into Lake George, has made its way into Lake Champlain.
Yeah.
Is the Asian clam high on the list, or what would be the next invasive species that researchers are looking at and saying, boy, we really would like to keep this out?
So one that we haven't mentioned yet is hydrilla, which is an aquatic plant, and it looks very similar to our native Elodea species. It's often referred to as waterweed, and it can grow in fairly dense monostands, so just the singular plant taking up much of the water column. So in the shallow areas, the littoral zones around the lakes, if hydrilla were to get into Lake Champlain or any other water body, that would, I think, be a full response effort would come into play, and luckily we have rapid response teams poised and ready to respond. The challenge is it looks so much like our native that it may go misidentified, so we're training all of our stewards to look specifically for this plant. And then, once it gets in and if it spreads, it could be more aggressive than our Eurasian water milfoil.
And that muscles out other plants in the water and it creates problems. Obviously,
Sure does.
Eurasian water milfoil has been an issue for a number of years. It does change the ecosystem of the lake, and
It
many
does.
believe promotes algae growth.
And that link to algae growth is a tough one to fully confirm, but yes, the typical impacts to folks who live along the shoreline is they can see decreasing property values if they have dense stands of aquatic vegetation growth right in front of their property. It's a pain to swim through. Folks don't like paddling through it. Motors can get sort of tied up in it, and you have to stop and untangle the plants from your motor to keep going. And so those are the impacts, really, to humans. They will push out native species. Because they grow in such dense stands, it provides limited habitat for the species that we want, some of our fish species and some of our other native plant species.
And how do you tackle it? Much the same as the milfoil? Do you try to harvest it? Do you use chemical control? How would you try to get rid of it or control it?
So if hydrilla were to come into one of the water bodies in our region, we would probably go after it with a chemical herbicide control. The challenge of hydrilla, which is a little different from our Eurasian water milfoil, is it has a tuber which looks like a little white bulb at the base of the plant that sits in the sediment. And so if you pull out the plants, you don't always get the tuber out, and you could have a pretty dense tuber bed in the sediment, which is very difficult to mine, and those tubers can be viable for a number of years. So the challenge would be repeat harvesting, repeat treatment, and in most of the cases where we have been able to successfully eradicate hydrilla in other parts of New England, it's been a fairly long battle of about 8 consecutive years of herbicide treatment plus other management, and then they have been able to get it out fully.
And the herbicide treatment, is that becoming more and more common? We know that for a number of years, people were cautious about using it in the Adirondack Park, had to get permission to use it. Is that the case, or is it becoming more and more common of a means to control milfoil and God forbid if hydrilla makes it here?
It's still always used as a last resort. Other options are pursued and researched to make sure that they're ineffective or that we can't deploy something else first. But for many invasive species, you have to use aggressive tactics because they're an aggressive species. So the herbicides that we use are becoming more and more selective. There's certainly concern that we still need to be mindful of, but the benefit of using the herbicide as opposed to doing nothing is significantly more. So,
obviously, the Adirondacks community is worried about hydrilla coming in. Is that pretty high up there on the list of species that they're worried about and keeping a close eye on?
Yeah, absolutely. So similarly, we train all of our volunteers to identify hydrilla and survey for it when they're out paddling the lake that they select to survey for the summer. Luckily, we haven't found it yet, but It's one that seems to be popping up in really odd, isolated locations, and I wouldn't be surprised if it shows up eventually.
Have you had success cutting back on milfoil, treating milfoil, getting rid of milfoil and water chestnut and some of the other invasive plants that have been here for a number of decades?
So your Asian water milfoil, we have had a number of really great success stories. Again, it's where we find it in smaller populations. Somebody is able to identify it, and we are able to use resources to go after it, whether that's diver-assisted suction harvesting, some kind of matting treatment, just hand harvesting. So there are a number of different ways that we can approach it, but it's smaller populations, early detection, and some consistent response. With larger populations of Eurasian water milfoil, we have not had good success with managing. Lake George has been battling for a number of years the Eurasian water milfoil populations. And the trouble is, you have something like Asian clam or spiny water flea come in or on scene, and that can pull some resources away from a longer term management program for a species like Eurasian water milfoil. I think they're not losing the battle necessarily in Lake George, but it's a hard fight that needs consistent effort to contain it and manage it at the area that it's currently in. For water chestnut, we have a different story. We have a really great success story, and part of that is because of the species biology. It's an annual plant, so it floats on the surface. And for folks who are familiar with the South Lake of Lake Champlain, a few decades ago, it was literally bank to bank. It looked like
Sea
a
of
putting green. Yeah, and we have been able to get in there with mechanical harvesters, which remove the floating plant along with the nutlets, and the nutlets are what will help that plant reproduce. They drop them to the sediment, they overwinter, and they grow the next year. So although those seeds can be viable for a number of years if they're missed or fall before we can get them, the mechanical harvesters have moved that population from about the Crown Point Bridge all the way south down to the Dresden Narrows. It's supplemented by a hand harvesting crew that goes into waters that are too shallow for a mechanical harvester to get to, and they go in and survey and hand pull water chestnut. And in fact, we're going to have 2 great water chestnut harvesting events for New York Invasive Species Awareness Week. One's going to be held on Thursday the 13th. It's sponsored by New York State DEC in partnership with Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program and the Basin Program. And we're inviting folks to come out. I think we have a 9 o'clock start down at the South Bay boat launch for the New York DEC boat launch, and we'll go out, show folks what water chestnut looks like. We'll harvest a good mat of it out there, and they'll get to become intimate with the plant and learn about it, harvest it, and then we'll weigh the spoils and report that back. Similarly, in Vermont, we're going to have a harvest day up in St. Albans Bay on Friday the 14th, and that event sponsored by Vermont DEC in partnership with Missisquoi National Refuge and the Basin Program and lots of the watershed associations, and we'll be doing a similar effort up there.
All right, and if folks are interested, how can they learn more about signing up and volunteering for that?
They can contact the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, the Basin Program, or either of the state agencies, and we'd be happy to sign them up and get them out on the water.
The website, the best way to do that?
Yeah, so it's adkinvasives.com. If you go to our events calendar, it should be right there, and you can register through that.
And you can also look at the Basin Program at lcbp.org.
When you try to tackle plants like milfoil and water chestnut, is it more difficult in the Adirondack Park because of some of the regulations that you have to deal with, especially if you find these in ponds that aren't necessarily right in the heart of communities?
It's been a learning process for all of us. I think back in 2008, when we first started engaging in management, we were very conservative, both APIP and the state agencies that we work with, and we had to vet whether the management approaches that we were looking to do were going to be effective. And we've been able to demonstrate that success over our 10+ year history now, to the point where we do receive significant support from our state agency partners to deploy the things that we need to.